Hey, Dr. Bob here. Who knew Steve Jobs could cause so much trouble even after he was dead, trying to figure out all the logistics of working with my Apple laptop here. And so, welcome. We're going to review a couple of things here today. And just wanted to catch up with you here. So, I'm going to see if there are folks from our team or other folks who check in this week. Otherwise, I have some interesting things to share with you. One that happened to me this morning in regard to another migraine patient that was related to a friend of mine. So I'll tell you about that. And then there's lots of questions this last week, and so I actually want to go over the 6 weeks that we have coming up in terms of what we're going to talk about, in terms of the 9 subtypes that we focus on. And so let's get started. Let me just check with the team folks here and see if everybody sees if things are up and running. Otherwise, there we go. Hello, Leona, can you hear me? Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started now that we have some folks showing up and tell you something interesting that happened. Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you. So something interesting happened to me this morning as part of another group that I'm with. A friend of mine said that thanks, Leona, that she had a coworker who had migraine who was often missing work on Mondays Mondays and Tuesdays. This coworker was missing work on Mondays and Tuesdays because they would be out, at the river, getting a lot of sun and, imbibing the type of substances that sometimes cause migraine. And so they checked in with him one time and said, well, do you think maybe your migraines could be from, what you're doing on the weekends? And this other person was very upset, sort of went to other people and said, this is none of your business, what my life is, what's going on with me. And, then they sort of had previously been friends, and this kind of sparked them to be out of sorts with each other, and their relationship needed healing. And so I said, well, what you need to understand from a migraine standpoint is that migraine is an invisible disease. And lots of people with migraine feel discriminated against. It's like I've often felt when I've had a migraine, or if I've had to call in sick with a migraine or something, that, I'd have been, if I had a cut on my arm and somebody said, oh, gosh, you have this cut on your arm. I go, yeah, it's actually not that deep. I just had a couple of stitches. It's fine. People go, oh my God, are you okay? Are you okay? This is terrible. But you can have a migraine that hurts 10 times as bad, keeps you from being able to think clearly, keeps you from being able to focus. You're just dragging through the day. It doesn't bother you nearly as much as the cut on the arm, even if the cut on the arm is long. If it's superficial, might not be hurting that much, might not be that much risk of anything. It's just sort of an annoyance. And as long as it doesn't bleed through the bandage onto your shirt, it really causes no long-term stuff. And so I explained to my friend, I said, people with migraine feel discriminated against because they are. And so when you say, well, do you think it could be because of this or because of that, and you're talking about triggers rather than the things that actually cause the migraine, then this person could be seriously offended and say, I'm doing the best that I can. I should be able to lead somewhat of a normal life. And what causes these kinds of things, unless you're trying to help, sincerely trying to help me, you're just blaming me for my own illness. And so migraine people are more sensitive, more empathetic, and so the last thing they need to do is to be blamed for their own illness. And so we talked about that, and I said, well, ways that you could heal the relationship is you could tell them, you're sorry you stepped over that line, you didn't really understand how rough it was for people with migraine, and you could ask that person, say, geez, if you're suffering from these a lot, probably some of the time I can't see this, is there anything I can do to help or to be supportive or to help other people in the office understand sort of what's going on with you? She went, oh, okay, cool. I've never had migraine, and I really haven't been close to people with migraine, and I didn't know that. And so that was sort of a healing moment, and I think it'd be a way that she can approach her coworker and say, mea culpa, I didn't understand. And then also, where to go from here is to build a bridge of understanding and respect and understand that this is a real illness, because the World Health Organization considers migraine one of the top 10 causes of disability around the world. So we're going to talk for the next 6 weeks, starting next week, about the different subtypes of migraine and what they're related to, go into the details of the features of them, the kinds of things that can drive them, and how they relate to the disability and symptoms that you're having. So the first one is facial, or the migraines in the front part of the face, and we're going to go into all the details of the different kinds of dental and jaw-related problems. There's actually also eye-related problems that we haven't addressed as much, but I'm going to mention to some degree. And then there are also factors related to the sinuses. And so we have two maxillary sinuses, which are the main sinuses, the biggest ones we have. But there's a whole cluster, like a cluster of grapes, of ethmoid sinuses back behind the nose. And then deep back behind the nose is the sphenoid sinus. And then there's the frontal sinuses, which interestingly don't form until you're about 9 years of age. So if you have a pain up here and you're a 7-year-old, you don't have a frontal sinus problem because you haven't formed your frontal sinuses yet. That happens later in growth. So we're going to talk about the relationship of sinus infections, fungal sinus infections, and a lot of different types of allergic and immune responses that can cause nasal congestion and be associated with as a structural cause of migraine as well. Then we'll also talk about the first, second, and third branches of the trigeminal nerve and how they can mimic a sinus infection and actually be a migraine. So the first week, we're going to be talking about the facial headaches. The second week will be coming up after that, and we'll talk about structural headaches. And I differentiate this over and over, both in our webinar and in our other course. The structural headaches are not the same as a neurologist would say. You have an aneurysm, you have a brain tumor, you have your brainstem is pushing down, through the opening where your spinal cord is. That's what in traditional headache medicine we'd call a structural headache. We call structural headaches things that are more related to discomfort in the back of the head. So chronic neck muscle tension and pain, some arthritis, which overlaps with a traditional headache diagnosis of cervicogenic headache, which is caused by arthritis and pinching and pressure on the nerves in the upper spine, as well as arthritis there. So we're going to be talking all about structural headaches and how you recognize them, what they're related to, and how they contribute to migraine and sort of the pathways that are involved in that. Then on the third week, we're going to be talking about 3 different types of hormonal headaches. So hormonal headaches are often thought of as just related to reproductive hormones, to estrogen, to progesterone, to the FSH, LH, pituitary hormones that drive them to go up and down on a cyclic basis, and hormones that happen with the menstrual cycle. But actually, that's just one subtype of hormonal headaches. We're also going to talk about adrenal fatigue, adrenal hormone-related headaches when your adrenal hormones are too high and when your adrenal hormones are too low, and how they relate to your stress responses. Because when people take the migraine subtype quiz, many people come up with having an adrenal subtype as one. And we've said this over and over, but I'm going to say it again, which is most people have more than one type of headache. Some people have 3 or 4. Some people check all the boxes. Then they have all the types of headaches. And so we'll have a separate section on, and we've talked in the webinar about how to determine which is your predominant subtype. But we talk about adrenal, we talk about the reproductive hormones, and then we talk about thyroid, because thyroid function is related to headaches. It's related to the metabolism of every cell. So thyroid function that's too high and thyroid function that's too low. Hyper and hypothyroidism, as well as autoimmune disease, an immune attack on the thyroid, can be related to conditions that cause headache. So we're going to go into all 3 of those different components of hormonal headaches: the adrenal, the thyroid, and the classic reproductive. Then on the 4th week, we're going to talk about toxicity in headaches. And so that falls into 3 major categories. There's glycotoxicity. So when you have too much glucose or too little glucose. So it's related to your sugar, your insulin metabolism, the insulin resistance we get when we get heavy set, and how that causes inflammation, how inflammation is related to headaches, and how we can, with diet, with manipulation of things that affect your blood sugar, and with other things, how we can recognize those as potentially a significant contributor either to the development of migraines or to the patterns of migraines that you get every day. And there's some markers and other things that we use to identify that and ways to track that down. Then in the environmental toxins, there's 2 main groups. There's the group of biotoxins, like mold toxins, and those are identified with very specialized tests. But first, we just have to see if you're at risk for that. And so we'll talk about how to figure out if you're at risk for that And then for some of these things like molds and then certain of the other environmental toxins, our big job in our support groups and in our course is to identify them so that you can get the right tests and you can get subspecialized care, because these can cause systemic illness sort of across the whole body, everything from brain fog to extreme fatigue to rashes to a systemic illness. So we'll talk about how to recognize biotoxins like mycotoxins from molds. And then we're going to talk about environmental toxins. Those are broken down into the heavy metals like mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic, those types of things. And then we're also going to talk about some of the other metals and their relationship to headache and neurologic health. And then other organotoxins, things like benzene and toluene and a lot of the organic pesticides and insecticides and building chemicals and other things that we're exposed to. So we're going to go into great detail about that. And then the 5th week, we'll be talking about trauma-related headaches. And so there's both macro trauma and micro trauma. So the macro trauma is you get smacked in the head, your skull's fractured, you get passed out, you get a clear bone concussion, and then you have headaches for weeks or months or years after that. And then if you have a second one in a short period of time, it's even worse. So we're going to go into some of those details. Then we're going to talk about repetitive head trauma, the kinds of things that boxers and soccer players who head the ball and football players get that can lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, how the genes for migraine, some of them are related to the head injury genes that put you at increased risk for problems. So we're going to talk about that whole evolving field and understanding about neuroinflammation that's caused by trauma, because the brain has ways that turn on inflammation, but it doesn't have very good ways to turn them off. And we'll talk about why that is, as well as recognizing it. And then the 6th week won't just be a wrap-up. We're going to talk about the underlying classic definitions of migraine in terms of the underlying set types of migraine. So there's migraine with aura and migraine without aura. And those seem in many ways to be almost different diseases. They have comorbidity with the same things like depression and anxiety and irritable bowel syndrome, but it's a much different pattern, and there's a much different level of risk. There's also a different level of cardiac risk. And then at the same time, we're talking about migraine with aura and migraine without aura, because if we treat, let's say you have 6 subtypes, and we treat all of those, the one you'll likely be left with is either migraine with aura or migraine without aura. So I've seen that repeatedly. So I have someone who has a headache that's predominantly in the back of their head. I give them some occipital nerve blocks. We work on muscle relaxation. They do some other types of things. That part of the headache is better. Then they're just left with a intermittent left-sided or sometimes right-sided headache with less frequency. But the pattern has shifted. And the pattern has shifted to show the underlying sort of genetic or characteristic of what their headaches are at default. And that's migraine with aura and migraine without aura. Now, some people will have that as their only type of headache. It can still be terrible and debilitating. So even without any of those other facial, structural, different hormonal, environmental toxin, or traumatic components, a migraine with aura or migraine without aura, if it happens all the time and it's severe or it gets to be chronic, it can still ruin your life. So it isn't like, oh, one of the phrases I hate the worst is, oh, it's just migraine. Oh, you just have a migraine. It's like, oh, my head just exploded. That doesn't matter. It does matter. And so we're going to tell you how these underlie the other types, and then we're going to go into the piece about medication overuse and rebound. So rebound headaches are today's medicine causes tomorrow's headache. We're going to talk about all the implications of that, what you need to know about it, how to avoid that trap, and then how people can get out of that when it happens. So that's our six-week upcoming mini course on the subtypes of migraine. Starts with facial. The 2nd week is structural headaches. The 3rd week is all 3 types of hormonal headaches, adrenal, thyroid, and reproductive. The 4th week is toxins, everything from sugar or glucose-related toxicity to metals, organic toxins. And we're going to talk about traumatic headaches in the 5th week. And then the final week, we're going to talk about the underlying diagnosis of migraine with aura, migraine without aura, and the overlay of rebound headaches. So let me just check here with our group and see if I can scroll. And I'm going to try to do this without turning things off. Okay, that's good. So I got that part accomplished. And I think that I'm looking for questions. I'm looking for comments here. Okay. Oh, somebody loves my backdrop. Well, that's nice. Welcome to Arizona. It's still a little warm here. It had cooled off a little bit, but it's heating up a little. And so reminds me when I lived in Minnesota, and one time I spent a month in Kauai. And so I would send notes back to my friends like, oh, it was a little chilly here today. It was 74, but with the wind chill, with a gentle breeze coming off the ocean, it was 73. So I don't really expect any sympathy now, although you'll notice that if I broadcast in the middle of the summer when it's 117 here, that number one, I'll probably broadcast from inside, and number two, if I'm out here, I do expect sympathy. But the rest of the year when I'm walking around in shorts and celebrating the fact that I was able to sell my snowblower, then you don't need to give me any sympathy. So I want you to know we're here for you for your migraine concerns. We want to teach you about the root causes of migraine. We want to teach you about the genetics. We want to teach you about all the factors that go into sustaining and causing migraine, from inflammation to trauma to stress, and then how those all relate to being able to find a root cause instead of being able to find a trigger. Because over and over again, what we run into is in the support group, people say, oh yes, I found that an ice pack helps. It's like, an ice pack is a hack. It may help you get out of an acute headache, and that's a great thing to do. But a greater thing to do is to find the underlying cause of your migraine, to address those root causes and get to the point where you hardly have any headaches, or you can hardly remember what it was like to have headaches. So that's our ultimate goal here with Conquering Migraine. We're a solutions-oriented group rather than a sympathy-oriented group, although we have plenty of sympathy to go around. Like I tell you, I've been there, I've done that, I've had maybe not a million migraines, but I've had a whole bunch of migraines, and so I haven't forgotten what they're like, and I know what it's like to suffer from them. And that's why I led off with that story about how it is pretty clear that a lot of the population that's never had bad headaches doesn't understand. And we want you to retain that understanding, but we want to move you over to the other part of the population that doesn't have headaches anymore. And so I think you'll still be able to remember these, but hopefully they'll be a distant memory for you. So let me check here and see if there are any other okay, there we go. There's a comment from someone in Texas, understands the summer heat. And actually, you get my sympathy, because when I grew up in Washington, D.C., and we would have temperatures of 101 and humidity of 101. And so as we get into the southern part of Texas, down by the Gulf, you guys have the humidity too. And humidity is just awful. So you actually get my sympathy in the summer as well. All right, so let me check on the rest of you all, see if there's any other questions before I sign off. And if not, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being part of our community. We're delighted to have you, and we're here for you. Take care.